Okay, let's go. So welcome everyone to Qualia Structure Journal Club. This is number 5 with Nicolo and myself, Ariel. Again, it's going to be very much what we're going to be talking about today, but the overall point of the journal club is we're trying to understand a research project that itself is trying to understand consciousness, and specifically by focusing on 2 aspects. One, the relationships between the experiences themselves, which is often referred to as the phenomenal structure or the structure of phenomenology, and then the relationship between these phenomenal structures and neural structures or neurophenomenal structure. And the way we're going to do that today is we're going to talk about neurophenomenology, which a methodological remedy for the heart problem, which is a problem by Francisco Varela. It's a bit old now, from '96, when I was 3 years old. But we think it's still relevant to the topic at hand today because nobody solved the heart problem yet or proved that it should be completely dissolved. So we're going to see what guidance we can get from this paper. And I thought probably the first way to start us off was this first figure from the paper. I'm happy to talk through it, but Nicolo, do you want to give us an indication of why this figure's in the paper?
He starts by kind of positioning himself in the broader landscape of theories of consciousness, views on consciousness, and he mainly writes this paper in response to Chalmers' heart problem, right? Which is a metaphysical problem, right? But I think he has quite an interesting attitude, right, towards it. He says, yeah, it is a metaphysical problem, but we can solve it through a methodological point of view, right? Like changing methodology.
Yeah, I think we should talk about that, specifically the metaphysical problem, once we've gone through what the paper's about and the stuff, because that's actually a question I had at the end, is to whether he really addresses the fact that it is a metaphysical problem or not. So yeah, I thought I'd just flag, it's kind of interesting, this first figure. So he wants to distinguish himself from he talks about, the way he phrases it is, there's the problem of consciousness and explaining conscious experience and explaining the heart problem. So where does experience come from, given all the facts about the universe and all those other things as well? We still don't know where experience comes into the picture. And he talks about, he talks a lot about how cognitive science seems to be primarily married to functionalism, which is the idea that there are the experiences and there's a description of systems or animals or humans that appear to be conscious, and we can sort of just stick the two together. I'm actually giving a bad description of philosophy 101 functionalism, but I think the general idea that it's just somehow you have a system that performs behaviors that are associated with consciousness, and by virtue of performing those behaviors, the experience somehow just comes into the picture. Maybe.
Yeah, I would just that the basic idea of functionalism then depends on how one spins functionalism. But yeah, that a mental state, like the identity of a mental state, is given by its causal role in a network of mental states and input-output behavior, right?
Yeah.
So you need both. You need both the input-output, the relation that mental state has with inputs and outputs, and with other mental states, right?
Yeah.
So when you have that network, you have the identity of the mental state, right?
Yeah. So Varela proposed that by saying, like, that doesn't explain anything. That doesn't explain why the experiences are the way they are. It's not really very useful. But then on the other side, he says there's these Mysterians, and he talks about Nagel, who just talk about, they accept the experiences, but they give no explanation for like where they come from in any sort of sense, I think is what he was saying. Again, I'm deferring to the actual philosopher here, but that was my reading of what he was saying.
Yeah, I'm actually not sure about Nagel. I mean, especially in the famous bad paper, I think he puts like he talks about the subjective perspective about consciousness as a sort of challenge to the physicalist. And I didn't read him as saying that we will never be able to solve the problem. That's something that McGee, for example, has said, right? That like
Yeah.
that solving consciousness is like for a cat to understand quantum physics or something like that, right? We're just closed, right? Epistemically closed. We can't really, we don't have the cognitive resources to understand the consciousness. That would be the sort of Mysterian way of approaching consciousness.
Yeah. So then, yeah, and then on the left-hand side in the phenomenology camp, you've got people who think like phenomenology is real and mental experiences are real. They're real things in some sense. And they're trying to have some explanation of the, I guess, both the metaphysics, like where they come from in the universe, and also in a cognitive sense of like how they relate to each other or why they are the way they are. Those sorts of things is the camp he puts himself into. And specifically, I thought this is probably a little bit too much text on the screen, but this is what he includes at the end of the paper as the like too long, didn't read, TLDR answer to like what he's trying to talk through. So I thought it might be worthwhile quickly running through his argument before we start picking it apart and asking all the hard questions for him. So as I took it, basically what he's saying, and you correct me as I go if you disagree with my read on his paper, is he starts with, as you said, like Chalmers' point that there is a hard problem of consciousness. So there is an issue with explaining where experience comes from in a metaphysical sense, given the universe as it is. But his claim is that he wants to say that in contrast to Chalmers, who thinks there's some missing ingredient, he thinks the problem is that what we need is some way of rigorously connecting conscious experience to the physical world or neural data or those sorts of things. And whether or not that's an identity theory or not, we can come to as we go, but he thinks there's some sort of like coherent structural resemblance between the two. And what he's trying to propose is like some way to actually go about studying what that should be. And he proposes a like set of serious methods in order to do so. So I think he talks about specifically the idea of phenomenological reduction, which consists of 4 different elements that essentially are combined of like somehow suspending belief about what the contents are that you're experiencing and feeling the experiences in and of themselves is what he wants you to do, which I think means like stop seeing the spoon, stop seeing the banana, see the yellowness for what it is. But we'll get to whether that's a coherent idea and what he's trying to say in a second. Then he proposes having some sort of like intimacy and intuition. So like some sort of like, I'm actually really not sure what he means by that exactly. So we can touch on that. Do you have an idea of what he means by intimacy or intuition with experience?
The sense I had, it was something like how justified the reduction is in terms of evidence, right? Can we doubt the content of our reduction or not? And the intuition is the methodology, or better, the step that provides us with reason to say no, we cannot doubt that, right? Because it's an immediate and intimate relation, right, with our own experience, with the structure of experience. It's not that there is me and the structure of experience, right? There's one and only thing. That's I think, and the step, the intuition step, is the thing that provides this sort of intimacy. I think that's how I do it, to be honest.
Okay, maybe another thing to come back to because I'm still not super clear on that. Anyway, but he thinks by applying those 2 elements of phenomenal reduction, we can analyze what he calls invariance, which is like these parts of phenomenology that are able to be communicated, and I think that are supposed to be consistent within an individual over time and maybe between individuals as well. But in order to do so reliably, people need to train at doing this phenomenal reduction. So they've got to develop some sort of stability in analyzing their own experiences through this phenomenal reduction that they're then able to communicate and verify and take to like discuss with each other. But he thinks that by finding those things and performing this phenomenal reduction, it'll be possible to find mutual constraints between phenomenology and then physical or neural structures or activity. And it'll be possible to relate the two to each other in some sort of consistent way, such that I think he thinks the hard problem will be, it's unclear whether he thinks it will be solved or whether it will be dissolved by doing so. In that it's unclear whether he thinks it will be solved in the sense that you'll be able to show an identity theory, or dissolved in that it'll be like obvious where the experiences come from in terms of their physical correlates or something. I'm not even entirely clear on whether those two are the same or not. Although I think the paper does try to make the case that it's more of like a methodological paper than it is a metaphysical paper. So it's not, perhaps not super committed to what happens once you use these methods and you get to that stage. It's more about thinking this is a good idea of like how to at least get a handle on the hard problem. At least that's my take as a summary of the paper. Does that make sense? Do you agree?
Yeah. No, I think you're right in there. I think it's more of a dissolution, right, of the problem rather than a solution to the problem.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Then I will stop sharing and we can just discuss. I've got a bunch of questions, but do you have anything else you want to say before I?
No, go ahead. Go ahead with the question.
Okay, so I guess my questions fall into both like the practical and the theoretical camp, where there's the practical question of like, how can we actually apply these methods in any sort of consistent way? Are they actually better than the alternatives of just doing like structured third-person cognitive science, or just like whatever subjective phenomenological research we've been doing otherwise, or people have done historically otherwise? And then on the theory side of like actually connecting this to the metaphysics and the other sorts of other theories that are out there. I also just want to flag for anyone who might be listening afterwards that I'm not an expert on Varela, neurophenomenology, continental philosophy, those sorts of things. So if you're listening later and you're like, you idiots, like this has already been way discussed, how are you not aware of this? Then like, just email me and correct me. Okay. But yeah, starting with the practical side. So yeah, he wants to develop this method, and he thinks by using this method, we'll be able to get essentially better data, I think is the idea of like relating neural data and subjective experience data together. And he seems to be quite bothered by standard neural correlates of consciousness research. I think he might list a specific example or two. But I think he's like deliberately doing this in contrast to like just having single binary correlates. So you can think of like typical binocular rivalry cases where you show a face to one side and a house to the other, and you measure the brain activity as the subject reports a face and then a house and then a face and then a house. He's saying that this is somehow better. If you like train people to do this rigorous phenomenology, they'll give you reports about what their experiences are like, and the ways in which they can and can't vary, and the kinds of, well, I'm worried about using the word content because he seems to object to the word content, but the kind of content, I guess, that they can or cannot have. And then you'll be able to see the ways in which all those things vary and find better neural correlates. But I guess I'm unclear on how we can be so sure that that will work reliably. And I guess my specific issue with it is like, just how do we trust people are able to do this sort of training? How do we trust that we're able to get coherent, useful data out of them in a way that's, yeah, I guess that's the question. I guess in contrast to different ways of doing things, where as a contrast, like, is it basic? Maybe I'm waffling, but sort of, is it better to rely on like fewer subjects who we train really hard and we try and extract all the useful information from them? Or should we be designing experiments where we just have like well-asked questions and then we ask hundreds, thousands of people and try and get more data out of them that way. But I am waffling, so I'm gonna stop.
No. I think you're right in saying that he's kind of skeptical about maybe the scope of the NCC project, right? Rather than its general validity, right? There is the point of like saying, yeah, like you extract like neural correlate or good, but for those correlates to be correlates of consciousness, you have to assume that the subject is conscious in the first place, right? When the subject says, oh yeah, I see a face or whatever. So he uses this expression of taking phenomenology seriously, right? Like that we really, and I think the key is that he agrees with Chalmers that phenomenology, that consciousness is an explanandum in its own right, which means is the thing that we want to explain to begin with. And if I understand the neurophenomenological attitude is that taking phenomenology seriously means taking the structure of consciousness seriously, right? Extracting this structure of consciousness, which is the so-called conditions of possibility for every possible episode of consciousness, independently of the content of consciousness, right? Like I have a conscious episode right now. I will have a conscious episode in 2 minutes and so on. What is like the core that remain throughout all these conscious episodes, right? And that is the structure of consciousness, I think, right? I think that's the idea. And how can you reach that? How can you know what properties constitute the structure? Well, you need to do the phenomenological reduction, right? So
Yeah.
And that's the part that I think he borrows from Husserl, like the transcendental tradition. So you bracket the world, that's the epoche, the Husserlian epoche. You bracket the world, you don't think about the external world, you just think about the subjective structures, okay, that are the conditions of possibility for accessing the external world, right? That is what constitutes the essential structure of consciousness. I think that's his idea of taking phenomenology seriously. So that's the first bit. And then I think there is the second bit, which is what you mentioned, right? Like how can we go, like, let's assume that I can do it for myself, right? I can extract the structure of my own consciousness. How can we do it like in an intersubjective domain?
Yeah.
Right?
What? Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, that would be the first step that he acknowledged, right? He said that the first step, the invariance step, right? So he assumes that we can do that like through a phenomenological method, but it's not exactly clear to me how we are practically go to do that.
Yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to pause on for a minute. So on the one hand, you can throw out, you can only measure things maybe that are like third person observable. So you can ask people to detect stimuli or have reaction times to stimuli or discriminate stimuli or whatever. And that's like good old fashioned cognitive science, but that doesn't necessarily tell us about consciousness unless we assume some sort of functionalism or make some other further assumptions. And then there's the way that, like, for example, I do experiments, which is where, like, if I'm asking people about their color experiences, and I get them to compare color experiences to each other, I use completely naive, untrained participants. And what I do is I try and just get like a lot of different, various, diverse, untrained participants, and I try and design my experiments so that I take most of the work from the participants and I put it onto my experimental design so that I can interpret the results of the experiment. As long as I assume that whoever's doing my experiment is conscious, I can interpret it directly what their ratings are as like about their conscious experience. And I don't ask my participants very much. And critically, I basically assume that anything that my participants tell me is about their conscious experience, as long as I've like screened out the ones that like fail their attention checks or like have reaction times of that of robots. But like once I'm done with that filtering step, I take all the reports and I just like take them all as like gospel. I guess what worries me a little bit about this like training idea that Varela has in mind is it sort of seems a little bit like wanting to have your cake and eat it too, where like we're throwing out some degree of reports and we're about able to say like, oh, that's not consistent or untrained. But on the other hand, we're also wanting to get like reports from trained people. And in particular, like he was very clear on contrasting his approach from that of what he called like introspectionism,
Yeah.
which is, I'm also not super clear on the details of introspectionism, but he said that field of research degenerated into argument from authority, where like it was basically different people with different pre-existing notions of like what participants should be saying, arguing with each other, and it became completely unfruitful. And I guess I can see what you said before, where like maybe everyone will just bracket their experience and think about the structure of their own experience and we'll get super consistent results. And I guess if that's true and like we can do that consistently, that would be super useful. And maybe I'm being overly uncharitable to the method when I also think about what would happen if all my participants disagree with each other. And then I'd be back at square one. So maybe it's contingent on the idea that if you actually did that sort of experiment, if you did see agreement between people, it would be quite useful. But it would break down maybe if you didn't see agreement.
Yeah, I think what matters is also like how you so how do you normally design the experiment? Like you show some stimuli or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And I guess for an neurophenomenological reduction, that part, yeah, that part can be some sort of a complement, right, to the entire approach, right? Because what you want your subjects to do is to tell you about their structure of experience independently of the stimuli, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Wait. That's the looking inside, the first step of looking inside.
Yeah. So there is a circumstance when that's appropriate that I can think of that's relevant to quite a recent paper. So there was the paper by Horn and Tononi from I think 2019 about the phenomenology of space and how IIT and cortical grids can explain according to IIT the phenomenology of space. And when I spoke to Andrew Horn afterwards about the paper, one of the issues I have is it has like all these axioms of phenomenology of space near the start of the paper. And like, to me, they all seem like very plausible. They're like, you can see points and you can imagine the points being connected and all these sorts of ideas. But it's unclear how they can be justified as axioms per se. Could you use something like this sort of neurophenomenological approach where like, if you got a bunch of people and you asked them to consider their sense of space and then they gave you all these invariants, then you could, instead of having axioms of spatial experience, you could use neurophenomenological invariant, like empirical neurophenomenological invariants. Even if you weren't showing people stimuli, like in the case of like, get people to look at a blank screen or close their eyes and think about space.
Yeah. Well, I had a couple of questions on the relation between neurophenomenology and IIT, to be honest.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I think that would be perfectly feasible. I don't know if it's coherent with IIT, because IIT, I think I assumed like that the action come from your own perspective, your own first person perspective, and that's it. I think you can do that only with your own experience. But yeah, I think like the idea and the idea of the invariance is exactly that. I think is to train people to do rigorous phenomenological reduction, and try to extract like the common ground, right? The common ground. And I know that, like, for example, people who work in this camp, I think Dan Zahavi, who's a philosopher who also works in this field, uses the phrase of phenomenologically tuned subjects, right? So that we sort of tune each other, right? Through phenomenological reduction, we can tune each other by extracting these invariants, right?
Yeah.
So I think that that would be the key step if you want to actually do some science with this idea of phenomenological reduction. But yeah, there is the question of how do you train subjects? Are there like specific interview methods? There is this idea of second person perspective, second person methodology, where the experimenter is really an interviewer that is just trying to sort of empathize with the subject. So there is a research program there. I think my problem with that is one, how effective is it? Like, do we really gather more information? Are we gathering a different type of information from the information that we gather through normal, I don't know, SCC or psychophysics based experiments? Is this somehow one complements the other? The scope is a bit unclear when we started doing things in a practical setting.
Yeah, I'm a little bit unclear on what even the base data is that you get out of applying this method and how the base data differs from other approaches. Like, I presume you end up with like linguistic subjective reports of the nature of experience, but I'm just trying to imagine of like how we translate this into something we can compare between different individuals. But I'm not an expert on qualitative methods, so perhaps there is a well-established literature on how to do those things, and I'm just not on top of it.
I know there is an interesting review in Frontiers on a second person methodology. Maybe we can read this in another section of the journal club.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, do you have any other method questions before we get to theory questions? Or other questions generally?
Well, it's kind of associated. I don't know. Like, I wanted to ask, like, so you said it's a kind of an old paper, right? I mean, it's a 96.
Well, it's old for scientists. I don't know about philosophers.
But for science, like for the science of consciousness, the idea is that it's a methodology that was presented 20 more years ago. So, like, my question was something like, why is it not prominent? Why is it not very popular, like, among consciousness researchers? It's kind of a fringe view, maybe, like, among real experimentalists.
Yeah.
Why do you think it is the case?
So again, I'm not aware of the history, so this is speculation rather than actual history. My guess would be is it just seems hard to translate this methodology into practice, or at least much harder than like other techniques are. So like obviously like binary correlates of consciousness research is really straightforward to think about and to implement. And even something like we've talked about previously, like a representational dissimilarity analysis, where you get like a series of subjective similarity reports and then you compare those to neurocorrelates, is fairly straightforward to apply in the sense of like you can ask a well-defined question and you can use external stimuli again and again to try and induce relatively related results both within a person and between people. So my guess would be is it's hard to translate this method into like a consistent and rigorous practical approach, but that's totally speculation. It could be entirely contingent on historical reasons or different camps and different theories. I really don't know what the answer is.
But I kind of had the same intuition there, to be honest. I think it's very difficult to, or at least that it takes time, right, to train subjects to do phenomenological reduction as you want. You need experimenters, right, who are trained in phenomenological reduction.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably, yeah.
I do get the impression you'd have a bit of a worry as well that like once you got the data out from people, either the reports you would get back would be, and again, this is unfair perhaps, and I'm not an expert in the area, but I can imagine the reports either being trivial in the sense that they would be like, well, I really examined the nature of spatial experience and I can tell you that like I experienced this three-dimensional thing and I can have experiences located in space along these three dimensions. And people would be like, yeah, you don't need to train to do that. Like we all know that. That's super obvious. And the same for like color or sound or other things. Or you'd get reports that like were non-trivial reports from people where they'd give you a weird, I don't even know how to speculate on what that might be. But you can imagine it analogous to the sorts of reports you get from people maybe in meditation or under psychedelics or other stuff where you'd start to get strange reports. And then I wonder if you just get skepticism of the reports that you got from people. So that would be another concern, but maybe that's been addressed or something.
But yeah, no, I think it's definitely it's definitely a question that is worth asking. Definitely. Yeah. Did you have some more theoretical questions?
Yeah, I've got some theory questions. I mean, I'm just amused because so he says towards the end of the paper, he asks, isn't this just some sort of like identity theory again that I'm positing? And I'm just trying to like get better at elucidating how this identity theory would work or some sort of homomorphic theory. And he says, no, not really, because, and let me try and find what his wording is. He says, not really, since I'm claiming the correlates to be established from experiential invariance or something along those lines. I'm not, I'd have to pull it up exactly. But I'm going to be honest, his theory still seems a lot like an identity theory to me. This mutual constraints idea of like trying to find the mutual constraints between phenomenology and neural activity or neural structures. I'm just wondering if you had the same impression that like ultimately, if the phenomenology side of this project succeeded, it would still then just be used to construct an identity theory?
No, I didn't have that impression, to be honest, because if it is an identity theory, there is only one thing there, right? It's not there is the phenomenological level and the neuronal level. To be honest, he says that at the bridges, and that's actually quite interesting. Maybe it is a bit. This comes from the 90s, actually, right? That the bridges are not from consciousness to the neuronal level, but they are from consciousness to cognition and awareness. So, and again, this is because it was a response to Chalmers' hard problems, and the problem is that, like, we have all these mental states, and consciousness is a particular aspect of mental state, is a property of. So the relation is between the mental state, mentality, and consciousness, not between consciousness and the brain directly. But of course, now we have, like cognitive sciences have kind of shifted towards being cognitive neurosciences. So now we can somehow like be more focused on how consciousness is related to the neuronal level. But anyway, yeah, the idea of mutual constraints in itself kind of suggests that they can't really be the same thing, right? Or at least or at least that the phenomenology has some sort of autonomous status, right? Otherwise, how could it constrain its own basis, right? If it's not autonomous.
That's interesting. I may have been under a different assumption than to you. I guess when I read mutual constraints, I assume that as like a mutual constraint, which you let me think of exactly how to word this. Let's say like I imagine mutual constraints between some other system. What is a good analogy of something? I guess I was thinking about it in terms of like there's variation in the observed values for both systems, but in an underlying sense, there's actually an identity between the two. And the variation in the observed values for the two system is just due to like measurement error about what's actually going on. And there's mutual constraints because like underneath, actually they're one and the same, or they're linked to each other causally in some sense. And then the mutual constraint comes from that link plus the noise, which gives you the observations. So I assumed that's why it has to be an identity theory, because I assumed the like observations are up here and the mutual constraint links the two, and then underneath there's really one thing. But what you're saying is like, no, actually that's might not be what he's talking about. Like there
No,
might
I
be
mean,
genuine.
that seems to be a possible view. It is a possible view, right? But so what you said, it means that like both phenomenology and the neuronal level, like they just seem different from our sort of descriptive, interpretative perspective, right? And perhaps that's the only thing that is interested in, right? Perhaps that's the only thing that is interested in, and the mutual constraint and constraints about understanding and trying to come up with an explanation, right, of this phenomena. Maybe is not particularly interested in the metaphysical relation between these two phenomena.
No, but I'm interested in what
Maybe
you had in mind that wasn't that. Like, did you have some other potential interpretation of mutual constraint?
Oh yeah, no, you can have you can have the idea, you know, between like a football team and the players of the team, and you can say that the movement on the team constrains the movement of the players, and the movement of the players constrain the unfolding, the dynamic unfolding of the team, and the team is something, you know, yeah, it is realized by the players, but it's not the same thing, right? You can have the same team even if you change a couple of players, right? So that would be a sort of mutual constraint that is not necessarily an identity theory. But yeah, I think he's kind of open to, or better, not directly concerned with metaphysical questions, right? Not directly concerned. And yeah, that is kind of so I just wanted to say that I found some similarities with the Anil Seth new account. I think he actually explicitly mentions Varela as influence, and I think he has this this idea of extracting phenomenological properties, right, and trying to come up with bridges with a neuronal and computational level, which can be given by, I guess, predictive processing and so on from his perspective. And, you know, this idea of finding bridges between the structures of consciousness and the structure of a neurocomputational level, whatever, is kind of similar to Varela's approach here. So yeah, maybe if that's right, maybe that might be a sort of might give a new impulse to the neurophenomenological methodology. You know, it can become more popular, more refined. Might be more research going on there.
Is this from Seth's new book or from a
Yeah,
paper? So it's from Being You,
yeah,
the new book. Okay.
yeah.
I've only read the first third of the book or so, so I'm not up to that part yet.
It's a good book. It's a good book.
Yeah. Interesting. All right. I look forward to getting to that section. Yeah, I think we've touched on if he's not really committed to metaphysical questions one way or the other, then I think I've actually touched on most of the issues that I had written down ahead of time that I wanted to ask about.
So I had a further question on, as I mentioned earlier, on the relation between this approach and IIT's approach.
Oh yeah, let's
Right?
hear it.
Because I mean, it's kind of IIT agrees with the idea of taking phenomenology seriously, right?
Yeah.
They said at the start, from phenomenology, they extract some sort of structural invariant properties of any possible experience. The axioms, the so-called axioms. So I think there is at least a similar attitude towards the problem of consciousness there. But I kind of wanted to know what you think about the overall project, because at some point, for example, Varela says that experience is not private, right? I think this connects to the fact that we can extract invariant, that somehow experience somehow public, and that's, for example, completely different from what IIT says, right? So yeah, and another thing again is the mapping, right? So IIT proposes a mapping with a physical system, right? Not with the phenomena of cognitive science necessarily. So in a sense, it's more general. So there are important distinctions there in the mapping as well. I don't know. Did you have any? Did you have the same impression that there is some sort of similar attitude but different way of developing it?
Yeah, I agree that they have a similar attitude, a different way of developing. Perhaps IIT is neurophenomenology applied by Tononi onto himself, where in a sense IIT starts with these axioms that are supposed to be obvious and immediately aware to people. But like obviously there are many papers, Tim Baines and others included, which question the validity of these assumptions or axioms and whether they're well formed. And it seems pretty natural to try and substitute then away from axioms into neurophenomenological invariants, I guess, where you could just try and see what's consistent across different people, and particularly what's consistent across different people who've been trained to like think about this really hard, and then use those instead. I'm not even sure if that would hurt IIT very much if it substituted away from axioms and used these instead. It seems like it would be pretty natural. You'd still then have to come up with like mathematical postulate descriptions of those invariants. But I'm not sure. I mean, obviously you would have to sacrifice the like axiomaticness of it, which I think is something that definitely appeals to IIT, but it's still axioms that come from phenomenology. It's not like they're natural axioms written into the universe that like are just apparent somehow. So yeah, they seem very obviously connected to me. It seems like using a neurophenomenological approach would only be a very slight weakening of what IIT is trying to do.
Yeah, I think there is something in favor, if you want, of the neurophenomenological approach. So, for example, you mentioned color. So, why is it not an axiom of IIT that experience is colored, right? Why is it not an axiom? Like every experience that I have is colored, right?
Yeah.
And if I understand, like the classic response is, well, you know that there are people who report, They are colorblind. They report not seeing color and so on. But how does that square with phenomenology? Like in that case, you have to say that what you know is part of your own phenomenology, so you are still extracting the axiom from your own phenomenology, right? You are just including knowledge into your phenomenology. But okay, but when you include knowledge, you know a lot of things. So
yeah.
you know.
It strikes me as particularly relevant to the question because I remember I've sat through like a lot of debates between functionalists and IIT people, and they often get onto the topic of like, well, what about when you're describing alien consciousness or animal consciousness? And you can envision that like maybe the axioms don't apply in those circumstances, where like maybe they don't have unity or exclusion or these sorts of things. And they sort of, at least to me as a non-philosopher, seem to get into an impasse where on the one hand you have IIT people saying, well, like this is about my consciousness or human consciousness or this sort of thing. And it seems like neurophenomenology would be the way through there, where you constrain yourself back from axioms down to like, for this set of trained individuals who we have reason to believe have similar experiences because they give the same sort of reports and they're invariants and they have similar brain structures and all these sorts of things, then we can talk about axioms or invariants for those people and go from there. And maybe it wouldn't apply to other systems. But that's definitely a weakening of what IIT is doing, I guess, because then you couldn't talk about other systems.
I think it would be a quite a different project, but I see the appeal to it, right? I see the appeal to it. The fact, that you are kind of broadening the scope of the phenomenological investigation, right?
Yeah.
I think that,
I guess insofar as, and maybe this is obvious to other people, but insofar as this approach isn't metaphysically committed ahead of time, it seems to fall in because you could initially weaken yourself and just talk about, let's say, humans. Use this approach, don't call them axioms yet, try and find like really good correlates, and then maybe at the end when you've got like a perfect description, you can try and strengthen it back again to axioms. And maybe you wouldn't annoy people in the meantime. Like
maybe.
Maybe. I feel like that was part one of what you were asking about, axioms and IIT, and then there was a second part that I've forgotten.
I think it was about the mapping.
I don't remember the question anymore.
The fact that IIT maps like its axioms onto like the activity of any physical system, right?
Yeah.
While the bridges that Varela wants to find are between phenomenology and cognitive phenomena, right? So again, I see the appeal in the sense that we think that, like intuitively, we think that consciousness is a mental phenomenon. So it seems to be like the more appropriate level at which we should find bridges. On the other hand, I can also see the appeal of the IIT type of mapping, which is like, why should we limit our investigation, right? What we have is just our own phenomenology, and we want to map it onto the broader possible domain, which is just giving them giving them most possible general description, and just the description of any physical system will work. So in that case, you have more explanatory depth, so-called, right? So yeah, I think there is a pros and cons for both approaches.
Yeah, I don't really have a strong opinion on that at all. Beyond, I see the pros and cons for both approaches. Yeah,
but yeah, that's that was what I thought about the relation between the two approaches, because as far as I know, IIT doesn't really mention neurophenomenology or neurophenomenological methods explicitly as an influence.
I don't remember seeing a citation to Varela
Yeah,
in.
from the
I know
report.
now has some citations in his more recent ones, but I guess I'm not sure if in any of his IIT papers specifically.
Hmm. It would be interesting, perhaps, to see or to do like more in-depth research
Yeah,
on these two methodologies.
yeah, yeah. I agree. We'll have to take it to someone from Tononi's lab and
Yeah.
ask them what they think of it.
Yeah, we should.
I think that's all I have for this, unless you have any other questions.
Nope.
All right,
I think we covered everything.
then I will stop the recording here.
Yeah.